Hey, if you're thinking about doing a timing belt or valve job on an IS300 2GZ GE motor, then you might want to give this video a good look over. I haven't found anything good on YouTube to talk about how to do this, and I also feel that the few that cover some of it cover it kind of badly or wrong. However, I am giving a disclaimer. I am not a professional and learning from my mistakes constantly. So this is a disclaimer that you can use this for your own risk. So if you're going to get into this job, you have to remove the intake, and you also have to remove this wishbone portion. If you remove the two nuts on this side, I think they're 12 millimeters, and a couple of these bolts here and the nuts there, you can pull off this entire assembly in one piece. You have to remove the water hose that goes through the system from there and there, and disconnect your throttle cable. So pretty straightforward work on that. Once you have that off, you want to remove your upper valve cover. Your upper timing belt cover and your two valve covers. And once you have your timing wheel exposed, take a 22 millimeter socket and crank the harmonic balancer's bolt clockwise so the entire system moves until you have your timing marks appropriately marked for TDC. Then back it up from the dashes to the dots to get to BTDC. This makes you safe from the valves and the pistons hitting each other during the job, as well as it puts the VVTi gear's 30 degree range of motion back to a consistent point and points the key in the same direction on the exhaust and the intake cams for the stop key. So let's get into some actual grit here. Once you have that done, you're going to want to mark your timing belt. So that's coming off for you to do this job. What I like to do is I like to mark the dots around the belt, and I'll have a dot for each of those spots, and then I'll mark a dot for the bottom if that's exposed, where that mark will sit right here while you've got that guy at BTDC and not TDC. So with that guy marked there and the other two marked around that, you'll be able to take your belt off and put it back on the same way, or mark your new belt with those markings. Check it 10 times. So I'm gonna drop some goodies here. If you are doing a full timing belt replacement, rather than just letting the top hang and doing it the cowboy way, which is perfectly fine if you're good at it, if you're going to be removing your harmonic balancer completely, you'll need a 22 millimeter impact and some serious cowbell. When you put it back on, be sure to use the right torque spec, and also I highly recommend for any crank bolt to use a removable Loctite. I believe the FSM calls that out in this car. It does on Miatas for sure. But once you get that off, if you're going to be removing that, you have to remove this guy as well, which goes back with Loctite 242, and then the middle and lower timing cover, and then this guy sits in between the timing cover and here, so don't forget to put it back. And before you remove this, if you're doing the front main seal, which is super overkill for most people, be sure that you removed this thing, the timing belt guide, 10 millimeter bolt, undo that. Otherwise you'll break these teeth, and now you're needing to buy a very expensive, kind of hard to get part. So having talked about that, that's overkill. The main thing is early on in the stage, what I like to do with the belt still on, I like to break these bolts loose. And if I'm doing the bottom bolt, I like to break him loose as well. This guy here is covered with this cap that has a not too reusable seal. And the tool that you need is a 14 millimeter male Allen. And then to get this oil bolt that has oil passage out, you need to use a V10 male Allen, this guy, and this is a 17 millimeter. So once I get everything set up for BTDC, I like to break those bolts, and if I have to, I'll margin it back slightly, and then I completely remove those bolts and these pieces. This is a good time to rebuild the seal inside of your VVTi gear. The seal that goes inside of here is just a big round O-ring, and my friends know they'll get one from me if they need one pre-built. This is a part you can order, but the part inside here is not in terms of dealer part number. There are plenty on eBay, and I think Summit Racing has one. Jeff Sy has one. So if you're doing the Jeff Sy one, the stretchier one that's already the right shape can actually be done in the car. You don't have to even remove the belt. But when you're removing any of this stuff here, have a rag and catch the oil. You don't want that getting in your belt area. Also stuff rags into any timing belt covers that you're doing, whether you're doing just the top or the whole deal, so you don't drop parts in there and have to go fishing for hours. Or if you accidentally drop parts in there, you're gonna have a really destructive moment that you never saw coming. All the preventable stuff. If you are doing the whole belt job, you want to have a tensioner ready or a press ready to take your old one and make it go. And if you're also doing the whole belt job, you might want to consider getting a new pulley for your tensioner. Don't forget there's a washer behind that thing that lets it freely play like it's supposed to. And the socket driven tool, I think uses the V10 on this as well. That guy needs to be put in with Loctite because he's actually not held in by friction this way. He's held in just by those threads, and that washer lets this thing move. It has to be behind it. The washer has to be behind it. You'll want to get new valve cover seals, even if they've been replaced in the last year or 3. And probably a good idea to get something like this crappy Velcro for the intake part that you have to remove so that you don't have any vacuum leaks on your intake. There's some, while you're in there, factor of like also doing a harmonic balancer. You could do spark plugs as well. If they've been done, then leave them be. Coil packs are probably fine. You could do wires if they're looking pretty trashed. There are specs in the manual for what to check for the impedance, but if they look bad, they need to go soon. I wouldn't get into that heavily. What is important is your VVTi gear, your VVTi solenoid is going to be getting pulled out of the housing. You actually could leave it in if you really had to, I believe. This housing, when it comes out, you could probably leave that in there. And if you know it's a new O-ring, then just leave the whole unit in there so that you don't disturb the O-ring, because if it's been replaced even after a couple of heat cycles, taking it in and out increases the risk of that O-ring getting damaged. I like to slide a piece of like plastic around it to slide the O-ring on, so I'm not hitting all the different grooves that are on the solenoid. But yeah, you can either leave it in there or replace it carefully. What is important is you will do undoing this union, and that union has a crush washer on both sides of it. It's an aluminum crush washer, and it takes a heavy mark from the face of this thing. So that guy is going to damage that unit, and it's not going to go anywhere well the next time. When you are removing these, they're obvious where they go, but for the remaining ones, all the way from E2 on the exhaust side to E7 and I2 intake side to I7, those need to be removed and kept. They're all marked to make sure they're correct when you're there, and put them back in the exact same order when you're doing that. But there's actually a lot more detail on that I'll share with you in a moment in terms of the process. Yeah, so on the face of your cams behind here, there's 2 oil seals, and you're going to be actually smushing them back into place here. You need to use new ones. There's no point in putting old ones in there because they're a pretty common leak item. Bear in mind when you're doing T-seals that you only want to oil the part that's going to make contact with like this moving part here, the inside of the T-seal. The outside should be installed dry, or it risks actually slipping and or falling out. I don't know if it's okay to use soap on the outside. I've had old timers tell me that, so that it goes in smoother and doesn't easily remove later, but I think of that more of like a transmission press build thing. So there is that aspect of things to consider while you're in there that I would say are pretty much a must do. So now that you've got the basics of what you're going to get into to remove the covers to start doing shim work and or cams, there are special tools that let you do shims that I have no interest in buying or using, especially because the last 2 cylinders are really hard. So the last 2 cam sets for the last cylinder are really hard to get to, with the space of the firewall being pretty tight and the little vacuum and brake lines that run through there. They're kind of nightmarish. So I would probably just take out the cam if I were doing that for shims versus fighting with the tool that goes in there. There is a really good video on how that tool works, but I see that being great on about maybe 80% of the space, not 100% of it. All right, so things that you're going to want to have when you do the shim job that are super critical. Oh, you know, one thing actually I meant to show you that would be helpful to you hiding here when you're dealing with the shims. This is a 15-pound magnet from Harbor Freight. It's like $4, and It may be able to remove the shims from the buckets if they're not too crusty in there. In my case, having been in and out a lot, it's coming out with this. No other magnet I've tried so far will do that, but this guy does a nice job. You need to have a decent feeler gauge set. Wipe the blades with a cleaner rag than this every time that you handle one of these coming in and out, so that that horrible metal meeting sand sound isn't going into your shims and your lobes. And you want to pre-measure before you've done anything. You've got your valve covers off, you want to pre-measure all the values that you have on what you're working on, and write down what your clearances are. This is one that I'm rebuilding, so these are some really awful numbers. The specs are actually, like say for this aftermarket one, it's 20.20 on the intake cold and 0.254 on the exhaust cold. It's actually a spec of 15 to 25 factory, anywhere in there, and it's actually 25 to 35 on this side. So pretty much the middle of the value there, and like the tighter value on that side, which is interesting if you're doing a track car that's using like a BC3011 cam, which is the 264. So for your track car, that's something you should bear in mind. They also do point out in here to clearance your bolt. So I think they're talking about the bolt that goes inside of here for both of these, to make sure that you're not stopping before you stop. Like because of the threads bottoming out, you have to clearance that, and there should be some work involved if it doesn't do what it should. Bearing in mind that actually when you look at this on the cam, you'll see this moving a little bit like this way, because this has to freely spin, so that makes sense. But when you're looking at it from the other side, you have to make sure that this part in here that the bolt is going onto does not move. That part will always be physically mated to the cam, and if that's not the case, you're going to have a problem. You will definitely, under some circumstance, rip off your pin from the face of your cam, and that will be the end of your motor. You'll be building heads. So yeah, you'll get your measurements with your feeler gauge to start, right? And then you can take out your factory cams. Now, there's two different ways you can proceed from here. What I do not like to do, I don't like to remove the shims. I like to put in the new cam, and I like to do only one cam at a time. You could do both cams, but if you do both cams, you run the risk that, bear in mind, these shims come in 17 sizes, ranging from 2.5 to 3.3 millimeters, and there's only clearance of 0.75 millimeters between the factory valves. And when you get into this guy, that's gone from an 8.4 to an 8.7, so you're looking at more like 0.5 millimeters of clearance. So if you have an unusual setup where somebody before you or some other situation has gone and done overly thick shims for some reason that they got by on factory tolerances with, you might be on the verge of making a valve-on-valve contact happen that's not possible under good factory circumstances, and that could be very expensive and problematic. You'll be pulling a head gasket and doing a whole cylinder head job, which I can tell you is no picnic. So anyway, I like to do one cam at a time. That way I don't have to put the timing belt back on, because otherwise you don't want to risk rotation issues happening. It shouldn't happen, but it can, and some people get unlucky. So I do one cam at a time. That's my religion from now on. And if you install that one cam per the FSM, and then you measure the clearance that you have, then you take out that aftermarket or upgraded cam or replacement cam, because these cams do wear out. So if you're just doing factory, it's still probably a good idea just to do this in this order. Now, why I don't take the shims out is that once you start messing with the shims, you're going to get some particulates and oil in between, and it's going to change your perceived measurement. So you're going to get a much better measurement doing old cam out, new cam in, with feeler gauge values for both of those. Then when you take out the replacement cam, you measure the thickness of your shims using a digital caliper. You write the number on the back and you record that number, and then you do the math and figure out what it takes to get to the specs that you're expecting, whether that's the factory values or these. Once you've got those specs, you can move your shims around. If you have a shim that's too thick, you can painstakingly lap that on a very flat surface like stone marble, not concrete, not your driveway, not a piece of wood, something extremely flat and solid with maybe 80 or 120 grit, and then work your way up to, probably a 180, a 220, and then maybe a 320 if you want to be really shiny about things. And do it on the side that has the greasy crap that faces the bucket. The side that faces the shim, or sorry, the lobes on the cam, they need to stay in the factory condition. And also I've heard people debate whether these should be coated, and I can tell you that, like, in theory, if you had all these e-coated with a nice like slick material that will actually reduce rolling resistance and probably give you like maybe 0.7 horsepower, but other than that, you're spending a bunch of money on stuff that's a ton of logistics, unless you're doing like, I don't know, 12,000 RPM motors or something like that. It's my opinion that's unnecessary. So yeah, you do your measurements, and then you can put in the other cam and repeat the process. You have your old measurements, your new measurements, then you take it out. Having done your feeler gauge work, now you can measure the caliper thickness of the shims. Then you take the math and determine what shims you need there. And now that you have them both measured, you can play shimapalooza back and forth to get the best numbers. And again, you can mill down a shim if you need to. On the sandpaper, you do figure eights when you loop in that. And otherwise, if you need to order shims, they're about 20 bucks a piece from the dealer, which could get pretty expensive, but you got to do it right. Now, by do it right, what I really mean is this. If you have a clearance that's supposed to be, say, 15 to 25 and you're at 20, that's good, but it's going to break in. And when it does that, it's going to wear down a little bit. And when it does that, that means the gap is going to get bigger. So your 20 is going to become a 25 over time. Maybe not even like during break-in, depending on some harshness and things, but very likely it's going to move by a significant number early, and then over time other things. Also, the springs are going to wind up changing and relaxing on the exhaust side because of the heat. So if you're running something that is very close to say the factory spec here is 25 to 30, what's interesting about that is that, like, technically as those springs expand over time, they could actually wind up riding with the cam and wearing out the cam. So I personally prefer middle margin numbers. I would like to be at 20 and 30 on most of my stuff. This guy, you know, you're going to be okay anywhere as long as it's wider than this. The problem is tighter. If it's tighter than that, then you're going to have unexpected closure of valves at the wrong times. So just bear all that in mind. On the other hand, if you have a larger gap, you're going to have that valve clicking sound. That's like, these are famous for these cars, especially after they've broken in over time. So that valve clicking sound is because the shims are actually bouncing off of the cam while they're coming back up. And because that space is very large, that noise is much more significant. If somehow that gap was massive, which is really not possible, the shim could fly out, but I don't see that happening on these motors. Not on the 2GE. So another thing you don't want to have is like a parts bin while you're doing all your work. Just put everything inside of a spot, or you can use a bunch of baggies and just mark them for what parts you're taking out to keep track of everything. And then let's see. I like to have, this is one of my favorite tools for knocking bolts loose without destroying stuff. It's a great tool, and I run it with a battery adapter. Yes. So I have heard from old timers that you can benefit from having an open circuit. So you can actually gut a thermostat and put a new ring on it, and you can replace this into your thermostat housing. And when you do that, you'll get a faster flow on your water during the break-in process, which, as described here, involves you doing 1525 RPMs for 20 minutes on this particular car and cam. And like in other cases, different cars, different things. So at that point, you can then put back the factory one, and you'll change your coolant in the process. You don't have to do that as far as I know, but it's an old timer suggestion. You're going to want to have a couple more things while you're doing this job. You're going to want to have FIPG. This guy here is the recommended one for the TSM's latest updated part number. You're going to want to have a torque wrench that can do about 20 Newton meters, so you can do the tightening of those guys as prescribed in the FSM for these caps, which these go in out first and in last, and they're really not consequential to your margining technically. I would highly recommend you have an assortment of different lengths of 10 millimeters, because the back gets kind of cramped. And then this guy's good for starting like hand loosen or hand tighten. Once you get things free playing, it'll be a lot better in cramped spaces. Not necessary, but helpful. All right, so let's see. I'll point this out to you that this is a cam that's okay for like a mild stage 2 track car. The 272s, because they have a higher travel, not 8.7, I think they're like 8.9. You will absolutely need to do a lot of things, and that is not for a car that you would need my advice on. If you're that guy, you're pretty much set. If you don't know what I mean by that, then you do not want a 272, unless you know everything about turbos and motors and blocks and springs and valve clearances, and you're going to be taking your head off to do that properly. Although there are ways, hard ways and dangerous ways to do that otherwise, which maybe it's a gamble either way. It's the same amount of work, you're taking the crap off. But if you're doing a 272, you absolutely want a PDM blue belt for your timing belt. If you're doing a 264, it's a good idea. And stock springs are probably fine from what I've heard from most people. Whereas like if you're doing an original cams, you're fine with like any old belt, a Bando or, you know, a factory, a Denso, you name it. So those are all good there. So I'm going to bring you to one last thing here, which is the Bible. So per the FSM, there is a position that you're at for when you're doing your timing belt, and that's when you're removing them. EM38, you're in this position. From everything I've read in the manual, as far as I can tell, during the removal on page EM38, you're in the position for BTDC. And I've done that twice, once with a stock cam, once with a factory cam or aftermarket cam. And in both cases, what I found was that the exhaust side was very hung up, and I had to wiggle it out in ways I did not like. So oddly, having rushed this on another occasion, I had myself in the position that's for install during removal, and it was much smoother. So I can't tell you professionally if that's safe. I can't tell you clearly. Like, I guess you would do these bolt patterns backwards if you're doing removal in that position rather than install. So I'm guessing, and I don't advise you on what to do there. The factory manual seems to imply you're going to be coming from positions like EM18s that we talked about here, and you'll be doing removal in this order, and that's what's prescribed. I can tell you the page before this, EM37 is like useless, and all the other pages I found before it, I couldn't find what I was looking for in that way. So the other thing here is that with EM53, this is when you're doing the installation. So they have you set up the knock pins as prescribed here, which is super critical because it releases the pressure and distributes it as fairly as possible while you're installing these in the prescribed order. So again, that's like this position that we're talking about here for EM53. And then on 54, they tell you to install just these two in a specific order. Then you do these guys. Now where this gets weird, where I think I had the most issues on mine, is I'm trying to be Mr. by the book, and I'm doing this step here. And what they're having you do is move them together 120 degrees. By together, I thought that meant 120, 120. I think it would be much safer to move them 30 degrees at a time. And especially if you're doing 272s, you might even want to do like 15 degrees at a time until you get to that. Well, that's a hard number to get to 120 with, but point being is small steps to get to that 120, because if there's any chance of valve-on-valve activity with aftermarket stuff or margin or clearance issues, that should not happen with the factory setup, you're going to have a problem. Also, if your factory cam is significantly different from the one you're replacing, or somebody did a shim job and put in some really thick shims, you run the risk somehow. It's unlikely. They have to be really far on the margins with factory, but just bear it in mind. It's not hard to move these in small steps. If you really want to be paranoid, you can put the entire timing belt back on and then do this process. But I don't know how that affects the intention here, which is that if you're putting pressure on this with a tensioner, I think it's going to change what they're trying to do, which is that when they loosen and tighten certain ones in certain orders here, it's helping everything get margined back to center, and then you're able to put the whole thing back together. So like this may be overkill. I like to follow the rules. And in my case, because I had a couple of overly thick shims or maybe misplaced buckets from the previous guys, or the guys before them, there was some pressure caused that made some valve-on-valve action. So kind of something you could avoid. When you do reinstall these caps, be sure they're super clean. Don't use gouging devices to clean them. Don't use a metal razor blade, and just use the amount of RTV specified here, just a 2mm line, and put that on. There's a skin job depending on your RTV that you're using, where you want to let the thing skin for 10 minutes or an hour. I don't think it's that long, but then you can torque it down. And in this whole process, for most of the stuff you're using 20 Newton meters, your valve covers go back on. They have, I think, two nuts, and then like a bunch of bolts to get on there. And there's an X pattern to do those with, which is specified in the FSM as well. Any decent mechanic would be able to figure that out by looking at it. But yeah, it's it's not a daunting job. There's a lot you can screw up. If you do the fasteners wrong, you could crack your cylinder head. You could strip bolts. When you're putting these things in, these guys here, so that's your retainer for the top of your spring and your valve guide. Well, actually, it's not part of your valve guide. The valve guide's deeper in there. But yeah, when you're working in this space here, you need to put a couple things. Sheesh, hold on, I got a little fighting going on there. You need, when you're doing these guys into these holes, and that includes the ones for the front caps and the tiny little guys that go in there, you want a little bit of oil on the threads and a little bit of oil on the washer. Do not fill these with oil. You will hydrolock and break things, so do not fill these with oil. Only a little bit here, and they'll play their way through. The other thing is you need grease on this stuff. ZDDP based Moly type grease. Don't just grab some axle grease. That shit would be wrong. And you need conventional oil, and you need some type of bottle to squirt that with, so that you can get everything properly lubed and wet while you're working. By properly lubed, that means not filling these holes up with a bunch of grease. Get the grease on your fingers, rub it onto your fingers, rub it on to the surfaces. If you can see it, it's too much. You just put it on. What I like to do is do all the lobes first, and then I come back and do the journals. And it's not a bad idea to measure the journals with your caliper. I was really impressed by the tightness of the BCs on these, and also the width on these were quite nice, and the depth were exactly as expected on the intake and exhaust. They were very close to factory values. It's the duration that's changing here for these types of tracked cars that we like to run on the weekends. Not giving you very good light there, but comparing the two, you can see the difference. But yeah, the point is, don't get a bunch of grease in these holes. That could really fuck some stuff up. Same goes for the holes up here, but grease this lightly, nice skin of grease, and continue to put oil on it while you're rotating to do all of your measurements with your feeler gauge. So yeah, that's the skinny.